Please welcome the Chief Executive Officer of the United States Geospatial-Intelligence Foundation and AGS Counselor, Mr. Keith Masback.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, John. I'm glad that you figured out how to deal with starving students. I'm eagerly anticipating my 4 boys coming home from college this week. We affectionately refer to them as the termites when they get home, because I will just be making runs to Costco or whatever hourly. I'm sorry that I missed yesterday, but it was exciting last night to speak with folks, and it seemed like it was very vibrant. It's exciting to see how this event has built on the concept that we started with last year, and how the energy levels, the extent of the topics, the range of topics, the depth of expertise is really humbling, and I think we're on to something. So I'd like to bring out my panel now, if they would join me on the stage, and just briefly introduce them so we can get started. See who's doing what in what order. Yeah, you guys feel free to keep mixing it around. Of course, so to my far right, your left, Dr. Lee Schwartz from the United States Department of State, who has just one of the greatest titles in our business, right? The Geographer of the United States, known affectionately on Twitter as #GOTUS, right? So close to POTUS yet so far.
Almost. Thank you.
And then Dr. Alec Murphy, a professor of geography from the University of Oregon, found out at dinner last night, although he may, in being modest, push some of this credit aside, like the father of AP Human Geography. Like, that's pretty cool.
Wow.
Right, so. I think also in discussion it came up that that's one of the fastest growing AP courses, that at least we've gotten through to our young people that understanding something about history and culture and religion and language might just be important in a world that's globalized like the one we live in. It's been a fight, I think, for those of us who've operated for a long time, but maybe there's an innate understanding that there's a significant value to that, and that would be exciting to all of us, and I know I'm preaching sort of to the choir here. Last but not least, Ms. Sue Gordon, the Deputy Director of the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency, 25 years-ish in the Central Intelligence Agency, doing some phenomenal things. Interesting path from a zoology major, right, to building spacecraft and dabbling in analytics and analytic tradecraft, helping them stand up their commonly known as sort of the intelligence community's venture capital business, In-Q-Tel, and then most recently, before coming over, helping CIA grapple with cyber, and then, of course, now reorganize significantly with respect to how they're going to manage that part of their mission and manage reorganizing the agency around it. She's arrived at NGA with a great deal of energy, and I think immediately has made an impression upon the workforce there that she is a leader, and she is someone who wants to get things done. And there is a gentle tolerance for some manner of timeline to get things done, yet there is a drive, a consistent drive with a consistent vision of how to make things better, and it is clearly her intention that every day she walks out of that building, that agency is that much better prepared to complete its mission on behalf of the American people and our allies. And then I think recently found out in her time at Duke playing basketball, I think the only 3-year captain of the Duke women's basketball team in history. So, you know, Duke's playing in New York tonight. I don't know if you know.
They are?
Yeah. I didn't know if you knew that. Mm-hmm. So Sue's obviously been pursuing excellence for a really long time, and we're very eager to hear from you this morning and then have a little chat about it with you all afterwards. So Sue, welcome.
Thanks. Keith, thanks very much. That was very kind. I was indeed a three-time captain of the Duke women's basketball team. I was also only a 2-year letter winner. So I'll let you all deal with that. Keith, thanks, and thanks to the American Geographical Society for the invitation to speak here, and thanks to you all for being here on this absolutely glorious fall morning in New York. As you're probably aware, Sir Stuart Peach was scheduled to speak here this morning. He is a legend in this field and has some very definite and well thought out ideas on geography in a world where the world's cities occupy an increasingly important role in the geostrategic landscape. But he's not here, and you have me. Now, don't run out to the doors, I promise, I'll be worthy of you. But let me explain that it's not really Sir Stu's fault. It turns out that the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Paul Selva, recognized that it was important for the two of them to meet, and you guessed it, they picked today. So Dr. Chris Tucker asked me to speak in his stead, knowing that my organization has been focusing on an increasing amount of our time, attention and investment in understanding the geospatial intelligence as it relates to the urbanization of the world. And I accepted Chris's invitation. Chris, you were probably wondering why, for two reasons. Number one, this is an incredibly important topic. And I wanted to share some of our views and then hear yours in the question and answer session. The other reason is you don't say no to Chris. I've known him since he was a pup here at Columbia, helping to make Incatel real, and I recognize then what you all know, and that he's a force of nature, and you ignore him at your own peril. Now, I realize that I have, in Sir Stu's absence, some impossibly large shoes to fill. He has influenced and inspired top people in this field for years, and I'm just as disappointed as you are that I'm not listening to him speak. But here goes with an attempt to be worthy of you, and just to make sure that we live up to your expectations, I am delighted to share a stage with Dr. Alec Murphy of the University of Oregon and Dr. Lee Schwartz of the Geographer for the United States. So we'll be able to give you a lively debate on topics of your choosing when we get to the Q&A. For any of you all not familiar with what my agency does, the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency delivers world-class geospatial intelligence that provides decision advantage for policymakers, warfighters, and intelligence professionals. I'm certainly talking about spy satellites, but more than that. Our motto is to know the earth, show the way, and understand the world. So at NGA, we deal in much more than just secrets derived from classified satellites and classified insights derived from classified sources. We're part of the U.S. intelligence community, so we work with organizations like the National Intelligence Council, which is known for its global trends that it puts out every 4 years. The last one was Global Trends 2030, and there's an entire section on the world as urban. And there are some powerful statements in that report, including this, that the rapid urbanization could give a boost to Asia's and Africa's long-term competitiveness and social and political stability, or, if not mastered, could become their Achilles heels. Global Trends 2035 will be out next year, and you can be sure that NGA will be contributing our views and reviewing all kinds of information related to the topic that we're here today talking about, megacities. Of the many responsibilities that an intelligence agency has, one of the most important is sharing information among members of the intelligence community and our allies, as we are with France in the aftermath of the horrific events. And I think it's something that we need to, as a group, really focus on. That sharing of the information that we each possess in our stovepipes from the perspective that we each have them is the only thing that is really going to work in order to understand the developments of the world that we're facing today. Now, besides being an intelligence agency, NGA is also a combat support agency, which means we provide the foundational geospatial data and insight to support combat operations, as we did with Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. And in the in the context of those operations, we recognize that the battlefield has been increasingly urban in nature, whether it's Baghdad or Fallujah or Kabul or Kandahar. But our mission is quite a bit larger than that, and it requires that we succeed in the open, developing open geospatial data and insights that can be shared with all manner of US government, international, and non-governmental partners, along with the classified contributions that we make to the national security apparatus. Yesterday, there were a lot of conversations about the future, but there were also a lot of conversations about the present. So I really want to focus on the 2050 timeframe. And now urbanization is a set of processes that will manifest differently in different places and often in unknown ways. But these fundamentally geographical processes need to be understood if defense, diplomacy, and development communities are to be able to preemptively, and I focus on this, preemptively invest in the stability of that environment. Providing today's information tomorrow is not going to be enough. We simply must be able to understand how it's working in a manner that we can project what is likely to happen, so that we can act before events dictate, because that's when the opportunities are. If we do that, we can hopefully avoid deploying forces into conflict to stave off emergent instability. Cities are often thought of as living, breathing organizations that can only be understood in terms of their continuously evolving processes and that make and remake these urban landscapes over time. They're a key part of the stories of humanity, actually both real and fictional alike. Without Calcutta being incredibly poor, Mother Teresa would still be heroic, but not as heroic as she was there. And this may sound like a goofy analogy, but without crime being a part of Gotham City, Batman would be a pretty dull dude. And any intervention requires an understanding of the fundamental processes driving this continuous evolution of cities and the historical and geographical processes that got the cities where they are. They're not just a landscape to be traversed or topographies to be mastered militarily. They pose unique challenges that we in the national security community spent a large part of the second half of the 20th century avoiding. A great deal of the mapping that NGA and its predecessor organizations like the Defense Mapping Agency did during this period was at the strategic scale, not at the tactical and urban, and certainly not at the human scale. We primarily took on mapping requirements for large, coarse-grained topographies, where we might someday engage in open and rolling warfare. But the emerging centrality of vast, dense, urban environments to the geostrategic landscape will make this impossible in the future. Over the past decade, NGA and our partners have been challenged to figure out how to map the world's urban environments at a much finer scale than we could get away with during this earlier era of strategic and operational scale mapping. In effect, the urban has become the strategic. And for strategic successes and the future of human security, we need to figure out how to map the world's dense urban environments with an accuracy, precision, nuance, and regularity that poses many challenges for us. For mapping with accuracy, precision, nuance, and regularity requires plentiful and reliable data. And that's often lacking in urban centers of the greatest interest. There are so many critical perspectives on our cities that we in NGA must contend with and figure out how to support. In many ways, today's speakers will do a great job of shining a light on these perspectives. As Colonel Mahaney from the Chief of Staff of the Army's Strategic Studies Group will likely point out later today, we have to learn how to grapple with megacities and support a full spectrum of military operations, whether major combat operations or counterinsurgency or stability operations or humanitarian relief. The same is true for whole-of-government investments and those of our intergovernmental partners. Baghdad was a big city to deal with, but it was less than 4 million inhabitants and occupied less than 80 square kilometers. Lagos, Nigeria, on the other hand, is currently 18 million people, and it's estimated that by 2050 it will double in size to 36 million. That is a huge difference. It is larger than the entire countries of Afghanistan and Iraq. And if you extrapolate that spatially, that could mean Lagos will be a city of more than 2,000 square kilometers or 800 square miles. I'm told that yesterday, my NGA analyst Patrick Ellis presented research about how Lagos's rapid growth has exceeded Nigeria's ability to provide basic socioeconomic needs and services for the residents. This lack of governance in major urban areas is of great concern to the intelligence community. And Lagos is by no means the only city that faces that kind of threat. As a matter of fact, NGA has partnered with academic institutions such as Washington College to collect and geospatially depict data from other megacities like Mumbai. And I stopped by Washington College's presentation on Mumbai last Wednesday, and I will tell you it is impressive and important work that needs to be extended. These areas of great rapid urban expansion are obviously of great interest to my agency. As Professor Latoury, the recent Jefferson Science Fellow at the Department of State's Humanitarian Information Unit, will likely point out this afternoon, there are an enormous number of so-called secondary cities. And these are cities that range from 250,000 to 5 million people that are poised to grow rapidly between now and 2050. And quite frankly, it hardly matters whether they develop into megacities or whether they simply stay really big cities. The challenges that they pose with building capacity in these cities to support disaster relief, emergency preparedness, and urban resilience are ridiculously huge and can be overcome if mapping these cities is taken seriously. Now, frankly, we know so little about many of these secondary cities that most of us couldn't even tell their names. I encourage you to go do this. Go do Wikipedia, go to secondary cities, and look at the list. And while you may recognize just on a pure population level Denver or Oslo or Hyderabad, mostly what you will see is cities that you hardly recognize, and yet they're facing this potential rapid expansion that will, again, from the perspective of my organization, challenge us geopolitically to be able to prepare to respond. I'm proud to say that NGA has partnered with colleagues at the US State Department on a secondary cities project that is aimed at long-term engagement with international and local partners. And the goal is to build capacity for continued creation of geospatial data that is focused on emergency preparedness, security, and resiliency. I'm also very interested in hearing the perspectives from the next session on cities at risk of disaster. Because of our humanitarian responsibilities, NGA gets a call every time there's a disaster that involves human security anywhere around the world. Because as this room particularly understands, maps and geographic data and insights are important to rapid response. And don't do it now, but if you were to go to nga.mil, you would be able to find the beginning of our provision of the data that we have in response to that type of crisis that is available completely in the open. Not on any kind of protected network, not for someone with a token, but for those responders who are out there working in an area that can benefit from what we have. We'd love to invest our time and resources in mitigating and even preventing disasters in the face of inevitable natural hazards that could incur. So let's huddle together for warmth. And as the Executive Director of the UN Habitat, Dr. Joan Close, is likely to point out later today, we can't understand cities and the security of humans that reside there without first understanding the factors that lead to their sustainability. This notion of unsustainable cities should frighten all of us and lead us to invest heavily in understanding the fundamental geographical processes that urbanize over the next coming decades. For all these reasons, the Department of Defense and our larger national security community, including our development, diplomacy, and economic instruments of national power, very much need to develop an integrated and spatio-temporally enabled strategy for understanding these fast-changing urban environments. We really do need a whole-of-government response, don't you agree, Lee? On how geographic data, technology, and understanding will help us understand the processes that drive this worldwide trend toward urbanization. And this strategy will only be successful if it leads us to have detailed knowledge of how each of these specific dense urban environments works. Additionally, as the newly enacted AGS counselor, Dr. Parag Khanna says, geography is not destiny, connectivity is. We are moving from a world organized according to nations and borders to a global society shaped by infrastructure and supply chains. I couldn't agree more. And cities, this vast variety of rapidly changing dense urban environments, will be connected in new and interesting ways by 2050 that offer both new opportunities for resilience and new threats to human security, fundamentally remaking the geostrategic landscape. A globally networked intercity division of labor promises a new era of global prosperity. And the global prosperity explosion in the Internet of Things, cyber capabilities, civilian and commercial drones, space-time, robotics, and smart cities have enormous opportunity for humanity. However, count on the intelligence community to look on the dark side. Fast-changing criminal, cyber threat, and terrorist networks will no doubt draw on the exact same global network of cities for their own nefarious purposes. We simply must have the best understanding of this dimension of urban human geography if human security is truly a priority of ours. And yes, I included cyber not just because that's what I used to do, but I think it's an incredibly relevant topic in any discussion of geography. Remember that all of this technological interconnectedness resolves to the physical, to the geography. Everything has location. Cyber is not a fourth dimension, as some would have you think. It resolves to something very physical, and understanding that resolution is a key to understanding how it will influence the growth of society and cities. Our future urban landscapes will have rich cyber topographic layers that we need to understand if we're really going to be able to feel the pulse and breath of these cities and what makes them tick. So Stu is turning over right now thinking, man, I would have said so many other things. And my esteemed panel here will be able to answer some questions with me that will answer all of those things you wished he had said. But let me leave you with a few thoughts, and hopefully they're 140 characters or less, so if they turn out to be memorable, they will also be Twitterable. Although, I will say, when you have geo in front of every word, you're using up characters at an alarming rate. So here goes. Geography, geographical thinking, geospatial data, and geospatial technologies are fundamental to understanding the security of our future cities and their changing role in the geostrategic landscape. There is just nothing that is going to be the same, even though the processes are the same ones that have shaped the past. It is essential that thought leaders from academia, industry, government, and the social sector come together and collaborate through groups like the American Geographical Society, that's why we're here, to help understand these vital trends and new thinking that will reshape the geographies of our cities by 2050. One of my favorite quotations by a noted futurist, Stephen Baker, was, "The only people who have adequately predicted the future are those who take the one thing that can't possibly be changed and imagine changing it." For those of us who are engaged in one of the most fundamental and old disciplines of geography, I think that is as true for us as for anyone. And thinking about how the technologies are going to influence that, not only in terms of what we'll be able to know, but what we will be seeing, will be especially vital for us to address. Combining traditional geographic knowledge with new technology-driven insights will be huge in understanding cities of the future. If you don't think that the reach that the digital environment allows will affect the future of cities, not just the cities themselves, but the relationship of cities, you're not thinking far enough in the future. If we're going to properly anticipate and shape the future of the world's cities as sustainable and secure habitats for the world's population, we need to be both diligent and vigilant in our quest to understand the proper balance of geospatial technologies, the new data sources they provide, and old-school geographic knowledge and thinking that's necessary. This has huge impact on how we educate our future generations. And for us at NGA, I will tell you we are, as Keith alluded, in the middle of thinking how it affects our tradecraft in understanding these trends and being able to provide the truth that the nation demands. The future of humanity in an urbanized world is actually bright, but we have to enter this era with our eyes wide open to the new and evolving threats, risks, and dilemmas that these new urban realities will pose. Geographic data, geospatial technologies, and geographic understanding will be essential to navigating this future so we all have future employment right in our hands. I invite, if my boss were here, Robert Cardillo, he would say you are all now members of Team NGA. I won't steal his line, but I will say that I invite you to join us in our quest to know the earth, show the way, and understand the world. I'd like to thank the American Geographical Society for allowing me to step in at this moment, to share with you a little bit about how we see the world, to join you to help us succeed in the open, to gather the understanding we need, to advance the data that will provide the answers, and then share our wisdom in how we put it together so we can understand what's going to happen in 2050. Thank you so much.
Al?
Great. Well, as commentators, Lee and I thought we would just do it from our chairs here. So thank you, Susan, for some thought-provoking remarks. When you started out, I reflected back on a visit I made to the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency some 10 years ago when I was president of the AAG, and I was there for a briefing. And I remember an offhand comment that was made that was intended really just as an offhand comment, but I subsequently thought was one of the most profound things I had heard in a while. And it was a guy who said, you know, we here at National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency, and indeed in many other agencies, we used to organize information by topic. Now we organize it by geospatial coordinate. That's really interesting. It means not just, of course, what Susan was talking about in terms of the role of geospatial technology as being key to understanding. It's a whole shift in the way that we organize our thinking about places and how we try to understand them and processes that are going on around the world. So it's just a kind of interesting thing that was sparked by our discussion this morning. But I want to make just 3 quick points, and they're in no way in opposition to anything Susan said. In fact, it's just an attempt to really build on and expand a couple of things that she said. So we remarked yesterday, trying to understand the world of 2050 is an almost impossible task because there's so many things that are going to happen that we can't imagine. Lee and I were talking off stage just before we started, and we were thinking, you know, maybe what we really ought to have is science fiction writers at these conventions, because sometimes, you know, they can use their imagination to come up with ideas. But when I try to look forward, I'm not at all confident I can really predict, but what I can try to do, what we can often try to do, is to try to think of different scenarios. And some of those scenarios can come from extrapolating what's currently going on, and then you can try to think of different scenarios. So we're in a post-Paris of last weekend environment, and of course, extrapolating from what's happened in Paris, but of course, before that in London and Madrid and in New York and so forth, one vision of a city in 2050 that relates to the geostrategic landscape is a city as an armed camp, where you basically have to go through TSA-style screening to come into hear a talk at Columbia University, or perhaps to go to a restaurant where movement is incredibly restricted, where everything is watched. That's a pretty discouraging way to look forward, but of course, I mean, we're already seeing, there's already discussions in Paris. I was reading this morning about, you know, new kinds of security procedures that are going to be put into place to try to make it more difficult for the kinds of things that happened the other day to happen again. So how do we deal with that? Well, one obvious thing, of course, is not just to recognize that cities are connected, but that cities are also connected to spatially removed geopolitical events. I mean, that's, of course, what we saw in Paris. And then it comes down to a fundamental recognition that if we're going to actually deal with the threats to cities spatially removed and these geopolitical events, then we really have to start taking seriously the kind of things that Mark Reed was talking to us yesterday morning about how we even engage with those spatially removed geopolitical events. Mark made a really interesting comment. If you weren't in that session, Mark's a geographer at West Point. And he was arguing that so much of the thinking about being engaged in a place like the Middle East can be dominated too easily by a sense of we can control things there, when in fact that's probably not a very realistic option. On the other hand, more of an emphasis on what we can do to produce stability, to be involved in supporting people there who are affected by what's going on, where we can be seen as part of a humanitarian relief efforts, that helps to take the inertia away from those who will plan the kinds of things that make it more difficult for our cities to be the kinds of open environments that I think many of us would want. Point two, diplomacy. If you extrapolate from what's gone on over the last 10 to 15 years in the way that diplomatic missions function, this is particularly true of the United States, you can see a shift from embassies and consulates being right in city centers, easily accessible, close to other places, to more bunker-like diplomatic structures that are hard to access, that are being, in many cases, removed from the city center to areas that are much more easy to defend. So extrapolate that forward. Do we see a world in 2050 of bunker-like diplomacy? And what would that mean? How do we combat that? I mean, one thing that's occurred to me in that regard is maybe a more collective thinking about diplomatic quarters within cities. It's hard to believe that diplomatic missions aren't going to be the targets of various kinds of terrorist activities. So maybe the solution isn't just to have each diplomatic mission in its own bunker, but perhaps to create some kind of a diplomatic quarter where there could continue to be the kinds of interactions that actually make for better communication and better understanding, and maybe some security related to how that diplomatic quarter might be organized. It's a thought. I don't know whether it's a good one, but it's a possible way of trying to think beyond what's happening right now, which is actually making it harder to conduct the kind of on-the-ground diplomacy which can help foster communication and understanding. Third and final point. If one extrapolates forward from the reaction just in the last few days of a variety of governors in the United States, of houses of Congress, there seems to be an attitude a little bit, if you can't, or if it's difficult to beat them, let's join them. What do I mean? Well, what I mean is that the perpetrators of what happened in Paris and their ilk have a particular kind of geographical worldview about places. Places should be mono-religious, mono-ethnic nodes that shield out the rest of the world, the opposite of what Susan was talking about. So now we see some of our governmental leaders embracing this same vision. Let's close the doors. We even have candidates for president calling for religious indicators of whether you're allowed to come into the United States or not. So then you can extrapolate forward and you say, are we heading towards a world of mono-ethnic competitive encampments, or are we in fact headed towards a world of more open, connected kinds of cities in the way that Susan was talking about? And the consequences of those two are of course enormous. Because as soon as you shield out anyone coming from a certain part of the world, yes, you may shield out some folks with bad intentions. You also shield out folks who can provide incredible insights and understandings and lines of communication that can cut against some of the problems that we've seen develop over the last few days. So it puts even greater emphasis on one of, I think, Susan's core points, which is to use our technologies to our advantage and accompany that with a sense of an unwillingness to abandon a notion of the advantages of a more open, connected world of cities. So those are the points that I thought I would make in response to the very interesting comments, and I'll turn it over to Lee.
Great. Thank you. Am I mic?
You are.
Okay, great. Well, one thing that Alec and I have shared for many years, and we've shared with the councils of the American Geographical Society, is a tremendous passion for geography. I mean, this is a visceral topic for us. And so, in that regard, I'm glad to see that the Deputy Director of NGA has now accepted geography as her religion, fairly new to the fold. And I
It's
welcome.
almost as good as zoology.
I welcome you, Susan, because it's really, I think, it gives us an opportunity to view the world in a unique and important way, and to help solve many of the world's problems. And one of my roles as the geographer of the State Department is to provide objective advice to our policymakers that is founded in fundamental geographic information that I think can really help try to at least understand some of the world's most complex problems. So as the geographer at the State Department, I'm also privileged to have one foot in academia. I've always managed to maintain that very important role, and I have a lot of respect and a lot of awe, really, for the work that's done by academic geographers, and I find that important. But I also have one foot in the intelligence community, because the Office of the Geographer on Global Issues is part of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the State Department. And when I first joined that office, I used to apologize to all my friends in the United Nations, and I used to apologize to all my friends in the UN and NGO communities for being part of the intelligence community. And after a while, I tired of that, and I flipped the argument around 180 degrees. And I posited that this was actually an advantage, because I was in a position to reach back into communities that had a wealth of information that could be shared if only we had a better way of managing the information and moving the information in a timely way to get it to people who most needed it. And so I've embraced that role as a fulcrum between the State Department and academia, and the State Department and the intelligence community. And one of my passions, those of you who know me for the past decade really, has been to mainstream human geography throughout the defense and intelligence enterprise, really. And it's a battle I fought for a decade, and I'm pleased to see, I think it's taken hold. And now you can find human geography programs in all organizations, in private companies that are working on geography, because they understand that we need to do a better job of understanding peoples and cultures if we're going to try to prevent and solve many of the world's conflicts and respond to really the human condition that's really important for us to think about as we look out towards 2050. My newest challenge is to try to mainstream how we attack urban issues in the same community. Because one of the things my office does with the Office of the Geographer on Global Issues, we have a lot of these transboundary, sort of soft power, smart power issues that don't fit neatly anywhere in the State Department or other organizations. Climate change, food security, human rights, science and technology, public health. But if you look at the State Department and USAID and other organizations, there's usually a person who is charged with being the food security guru, the public health policymaker, the person in charge of climate change negotiations. For urban issues, you look around and there is no single focal point that owns that issue. And I've been trying for the past year, I've been struggling with trying to figure out how we tackle urbanization from a policy perspective, how we tackle it really from an intelligence perspective in terms of managing the information in a way that makes the most sense for highlighting the problems that are unique to the urban condition, the urban forms, but really touch on all of the other issues that I mentioned, like climate change, food security, public health, and a host of other issues. So I think going forward, this allows us to try to galvanize our policymakers, our Defense Department, the 3Ds, diplomacy, defense, and development, to really bring our collective efforts together and try to raise the profile of urban growth, urban challenges as a cross-cutting issue throughout government if we're going to try to make some changes. Finally, I have to mention that Susan talked about mapping. And we're all here. It's a geographical conference, and when we're thinking about 2050, my goodness, the information that's going to be available to map movements and locations, and we're going to be mapping people moving inside homes and inside buildings. The challenges of thinking about how we map our space in 2050 is really something I think that almost requires a science fiction writer to get their hands around. So I appreciate Sue's comments about mapping, because at the end of the day, that's what I think is my job. We produce maps and we try to inform our policymakers by the use of maps. And so I think I'll end with my comments there and let the audience ask some questions. Thank you.
You have anything to add, Sue?
Well, love your point about location of U.S. embassies and how we think about our diplomatic presence. I think that is a topic that people have been addressing. It's that dual-edged sword of security and what's the best way to be secure. But to me, that and your point, Lee, really are so important, because in the intelligence business, it's understanding the culture that allows you to both predict activity and influence engagements. And I think that we are sometimes building off a model that no longer exists. Mm-hmm. Our models of the former Soviet Union and other nation states that increasingly are not what's dominating the picture. Understanding these forces are really incredibly important to know how to preempt, influence, understand. So good stuff.
So I think at best we have an opportunity for one question and some very succinct answers. Is there a question in the room?
He's pointing at us.
Hi, my name is Wes Reiser. I'm also with the State Department, but with the United Nations side of the House. Thanks, Susan, for your comments. They were really very useful and interesting. A question that really rose for me with all of this as well, I train a lot of your NGA folks as they come through Foreign Service Institute for our regional studies courses. And the organization that we have is very much around analysts who work on specific countries. And because of that are missing the broader region. Right. And both within NGA and within the State Department, even within the regional structures, miss those places that are adjacent. So like if you're working on Algeria, because that's in the Middle East region, you're not thinking about Mali, even though the flows of terrorists across the Sahara is one of the biggest flows we need to think about. So I was interested in your thoughts on how we can kind of escape that box and better as a government train people across and better cross-communicate outside of the nation-state construct and even the region construct.
You said pithy answer? Okay, so here's a great topic of conversation. Two things. One, internally, what you would see, if you were in NGA today, you would see us developing cross-cutting, what we call mission managers, because we recognize that this kind of functional alignment or geographic alignment is not sufficient, and so we're creating the opportunity to do the cross-cutting mission management that allow you to do regional stability, counterterrorism, those sorts of issues. At an intelligence community and a larger governmental issue, I would say that there's great hope on the horizon. If you look at the community today versus 10 years ago, you would see that if each agency were sitting up here, they would be talking about the world in the exact same way, not just from the perspective of that agency. And there's great hope in the fact that we are not, each of us who do something particular, looking at these issues from the particular craft that we represent, but from the integration of those two. So I think you're seeing this coming. What we need to do is we need to continue to provide the opportunities for that integration.
Can I just piggyback for 30 seconds, because I know we're out of time. But a fundamental tool that geographers use when looking at any kind of pattern is to ask critical questions about it. What's hidden and what's revealed when you adopt a particular spatial framework for asking a question. This is something that we need fundamentally to do throughout our society. The map of states, I mean, those boundaries weren't there 100 years ago, and yet somehow we see that map, and then that becomes the space we talk about. Of course, that space matters in some ways, but we need to think critically about it. We need to have the habit of mind whenever we see a pattern to ask what's hidden and what's revealed. That's part of the geographic cause that Lee was talking about and that we've shared over the years. Thanks.
Brilliant.
Well, I thank you for your time. I apologize that we weren't able to get to more of your questions. I think that most of us will certainly be around the bulk of the day, so don't hesitate to grab us because we're happy to talk about it. Thank you for the opportunity, John. Thank you.